Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to discuss the subject with you entitled The Mechanics of the State Legislature. In discussing that subject, we are proposing to discuss the introduction of bills and how they get through the legislative process into the governor's desk. We also want to talk about the organization prior to the introduction of legislation. Many of you have never had that opportunity to watch the inside of the legislative process, and we thought you might be interested in that subject. In order to do that, we're so happy to welcome to our program today a member of the Idaho State Legislature. Our guest is Representative Dean Hageson, who is in his second term in the state legislature. And in our state of Idaho, the newspaper and other journalists who cover the legislature at the end of the session always talk about the quality of the legislators. And our guest today has been listed by that media as one of the movers and shakers of the Idaho legislature, that he's very effective. He's also been described as the member of the House that is very prominent in the leadership of the moderate forces in the House, and he comes from Coeur d'Alene. Representative Hageson, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Thanks, Tony. It's good to be here.
I also am so happy to have someone who is so involved, and I have followed your career in the legislature carefully, and I think we have made a wise choice with someone that can really talk about how can you be effective in dealing with legislation. If you would be so kind as to do so, I would like to ask you to start out by telling us in the Idaho legislature, and I understand that most states follow somewhat basically the same procedures, that after the election in November, that both the House and the Senate membership meet in December prior to the January session and go through the organization process. Would you kind of take us through that and how that works?
Sure, Tony. It's called the organizational session. It takes place about the first week in December and is only for a couple days. And the purpose of that session is to organize the legislature by electing the leadership, minority, majority leadership in both houses of the legislature, and to make the committee assignments. And the committee assignments are made by the elected leadership, with the majority appointing majority members to the committees, and the minority appointing the minority members of the committees, and the makeup of the committees in the same percentage as those parties represent in whichever house. So, for example, in the House we have about an 80-20 Republican majority. So 80% of the committee members would be Republicans and 20% Democrats, and those are picked by the elected leadership, which is the Speaker, Majority Leader, Assistant Majority Leader, and Caucus Chairman, with obviously the Speaker having the greatest amount of say in that. Likewise in the Senate, in the same manner they're selected over there. There they have exactly a 2/3, so it's 2 Republicans to 1 Democrat on committees.
So as the organization takes place, the very first thing you do in caucus, you do elect that key leadership of the House and the Senate, and then from that leadership, then the committee assignments are made. I believe also in the Idaho Senate we have a little different system than in some states. It's my understanding that in a number of states the top leadership position in the Senate is the majority leader, but in our case it's the president pro temp of the Senate. Isn't that the case?
Yes, the presiding officer in the Senate is, in our state, is Lieutenant Governor, but the leader of the Senate really is the president pro tem, is the highest elected majority member. And then you have a majority leader, assistant again, and a caucus chairman. That election in the House, we have a meeting of all members the night before the elections where candidates for each position make their pitches, and then the election takes place the next morning. As the first order of business of the organizational meeting, you come to order, have a prayer by the chaplain and so on, and adjourn to the caucus where these elections take place. In the Senate, they have gone to doing those elections that night before, and then they immediately go into business the next day, into the committee assignments and so on.
Very good. Now, once that organization is in place, or I want to back up and say that even before that is in place, that each of you, when you arrive, there are a number of permanent or standing committees that are very important and deal with specific legislation. And even though you've explained how those assignments are made, I would assume that individual members from a list can show preferences, and then the leadership has that to look at. What is one's chance of getting, first of all, I guess, how many committees can one normally expect to be on of permanent committees? And secondly, how easy is it to get on one or two committees that one really prefers as their first or second choice?
Well, Tony, that depends a lot on what your first and second choice are. It's done exactly as you suggest. Members are asked to indicate their first, second, and third preference for committees. There are what are considered major committees and minor committees. Major committees meet daily in the morning. Minor committees meet on alternate days in the afternoon. And some committees are more sought after than others. The Joint Finance and Appropriation Committee, which is the House Appropriation Committee meeting jointly with the Senate Finance Committee, is a very powerful committee. It's a difficult committee to get on, and a freshman is unlikely to get on that committee, for example. And one who is not at least in relatively good favor with leadership of his party is not likely to get on that committee. It's probably to only slightly lesser extent that's true of the Revenue and Taxation Committee in the House. State Affairs, that I serve on as a major committee, is, I believe, one of the most enjoyable and fun committees that deals with a wide range of subjects, and I was able to get on State Affairs as a freshman. As far as the committee assignments, you would either have 2 or 3 normally. Many members have only 2 minor committees. They have no major committees, many freshmen, or they have 1 major and 1 minor. I was fortunate enough to get 3 committees the first year, and have stayed on those same 3 committees. So I have 2 minors and 1 major committee. With the greater membership of the House through reapportionment, there were a couple new committees created, and a couple of them were enlarged, but even so, it's impossible to get 3 committee assignments for everyone, and it's even hard to get a major committee assignment for everyone. We had many freshmen this last year, and many of those serve on no major committee for their first term at least.
You've mentioned the Joint Finance Appropriation Committee that deals in our state with, of course, the budgetary process, which is so key to so many agencies and education, other fields. There are a number of other major committees, and you're serving on one of those. Would you take us through 2 or 3 of those committees and explain to us the kind of legislation they would address?
Well, first of all, let's start with the Appropriations Committee, which does recommend the appropriations. Obviously, those appropriations must be passed by each body and signed by the governor. But the initial appropriation bills come out of that committee. And that's essentially all that committee deals with. And they delve into the state budget from top to bottom. They take a testimony from all the state agencies and from outsiders relative to recommendations on those budgets. They deal with appropriation. Revenue and Taxation, as its name would suggest, deals with revenue and taxation measures, changes in the tax law. The State Affairs Committee that I serve on has a very wide range of responsibilities. It has to do with, I guess again, as the name suggests, things that are of statewide interest. And among those things might be the question of whether we should have a state lottery. It would be a state affairs question. The question of drinking age in the state is a state affairs committee. Labor law, like right to work, came through state affairs committee. So election things, reapportionment was state affairs, those sorts of things. Then, well, the Education Committee, I consider it major. It's actually officially a minor committee, but it does meet daily. It's the only one that does. Deals with education issues primarily.
The Judiciary Committee also would become important at certain times, would it not? If you were, for example, if you were proposing to do a major restructure of the judicial system of the state, that would go through that committee.
Yes, it would. The Judiciary and Rules Committee is a afternoon committee, a minor committee, however.
Yes.
I believe.
Yes. Representative Higginson, let's do like we do in a political science 101 class. Let's take our audience through the process. Take a let's suppose we have a major or significant piece of legislation that's going to be introduced, such as the lottery issue or whatever it might be, and let's let you carry the bill for us. And how would you do that as a member of the House and getting it through the House, and then how would you, as the major sponsor, work with others in the other chamber to try to get through the Senate, and then how does one work with the governor to try to get it signed into law?
Okay, well, the first step is to draft properly the piece of legislation, and we have help with that down there. We're not all lawyers down there, and probably that's considered fortunate we're not all. In fact, there are not that many. There is a branch of government called the Legislative Council, and they help legislators draft the bill. So you would go down to Legislative Council, which is in the basement of the State House, and say, this is what I would like to do. I'd like to propose a lottery bill along these lines. And they would assist you in drafting it, and it would come back to you in what's called RS form, routing service. It would be assigned a number, and it would be RS number, whatever. You then have the choice of introducing that as a personal bill, which up until the 25th day of the legislature, you simply take it to the clerk and say, I want to introduce this. And it will be printed, and it will be assigned a bill number. It's quite rare to do that because it's circumvents to a certain extent the committee process, although it's still get a committee hearing in that manner, but it's not regarded as good form. It's in Idaho legislature, at least, it's much more desirable to take it to a committee. So what you would do then is take it to the State Affairs Committee and ask the chairman to put it on his agenda. That's step one, and you get it on the agenda and have the committee hear it, and you, as the sponsor, testify before the committee. Perhaps bring even other witnesses at that point, although at the RS stage it's somewhat discouraged or time consideration. If the committee sees a reasonable level of possibility for this measure, it's not something that's off the wall and they don't want to deal with it all, they will usually agree to print it, and they vote then for introduction, which means that the bill will be assigned a bill number, and it will then go to the Speaker, and he will assign that to a committee for hearings. And in the case of a lottery bill, he would no doubt assign it to the State Affairs Committee. So now that committee would hear it a second time, this time in bill form. This time the state has received notification that the bill is under consideration, and interested parties can contact the legislators or can schedule that opportunity to testify before the committee themselves, and the committee would act upon it. And the committee would either vote to hold it in the committee or to send it to the floor with the recommendation that it be passed. I might back up to the first instance in an RS form. The committee, at that point, the RS is considered to be the property of the sponsor. The committee has two choices: to introduce or to return to the sponsor. They cannot hold it in the committee, for example, because the technical term is that it's the property of the sponsor. Once it's a bill form, it's in the hands of the legislature, and it's when it's assigned to that committee, it's in the committee's hands. They can do as they choose. If they choose to send it to the floor with a recommendation that it pass, then the entire House would vote on the measure. If it passes the House, it would then go to the Senate and be assigned by the pro tem to a Senate committee. And again, in this case, probably Senate State Affairs, although he's under no obligation to do that. He would likely send it to that committee. Then, as you suggest with your question, there's a bit of lobbying that the sponsor may want to do with that committee, either one-on-one with those people and or ask the committee chairman for the opportunity to be on the agenda and speak to the committee and try to convince the Senate committee to report the bill out favorably. If they do that, then it must be voted on by the entire Senate. If the Senate acts favorably, then it goes to the governor for signature.
If during that time on the Senate there is some amendments or changes in the bill, it goes back to the House for attempt to accept those amendments. Is that correct? If
it's amended in the Senate, it would come back to the House, and the question before the House would be, should the House concur in the Senate amendments to House Bill 475 or whatever it happened to be. And if the House agrees to concur, and then the Senate version is accepted. If the House does not agree, then conference committees would be appointed by the Speaker and the Pro Tem respectively to sit down and see if they couldn't iron out their differences, come to some, either accept one version or the other, or some compromise, and then pass the houses again. It's a very cumbersome process, as the description probably suggests, and it was difficult for me initially, especially coming from being a private business, a small business, and running it myself, where you could make yes or no decisions and act upon them promptly. It takes a good deal of time to get this process done. It's cumbersome, and there are a lot of pitfalls along the way, many things that can happen to you or to your bill. It can be amended in a manner that you do not wish to see happen. Committee chairman can sort of neglect for some period of time to put it on their agenda to slow down the process. It can be, once it finally gets to the floor, put on the amending order of business for amendment and held there for a while. And all these things can delay, and they may be legitimate reasons by the parties offering these kind of amendments, or it may simply be a tactic to kill or destroy your bill. So there are lots of pitfalls. It's hard to get a piece of legislation all the way through that path. However, I've come to believe that it's a very good system, and it precludes most bad legislation from getting all the way through that process. I think that's good, and I think the committee hearings on both sides of the rotunda, many times something gets through one house or the other with minimal debate, and some element or some aspect of the law, proposed law, has not really been thought through very well. But by the time it gets to the committee hearings on the other side, the citizens of the state have seen it, and those most directly affected have made their peers aware of it, and they've all come to Boise to demand to have their say in the Senate committee. And I think it's a good process to winnow the wheat from the chaff.
In the political science literature, you certainly done a fine job explaining why the bicameral system has some advantages over the unicameral. And in that literature, it always indicates that, as you've done so, that the citizens become aware once it gets through a House, it gets more publicity, and then that process can take place. In relation to this now, when it gets to the governor, and I know all states are somewhat different, but in Idaho's case, the governor does not have a very long period of time in which to make his decision. And could you tell us what his options are, and then if he doesn't sign it, what can happen?
The governor has 5 legislative days, and he has actually a little over Saturdays are considered legislative days for that purpose, and he has till the end of the 5th day. So in other words, if he get a bill at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Friday, it would be Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. By the end of Thursday, close of business, he would have to have acted on that legislation. Or his failure to act means that the measure becomes law without his signature. His options are to sign it, to veto it, or to simply allow it to become law without his signature. And that takes place at the end of the 5th legislative day after it arrives at his desk. There are some clerical things that take place after the signing. And this can take, a bill may pass the House, move over, pass the Senate, and it may be 2 or 3 days even after that before it arrives at the governor's desk, because it has to go back to the originating House to be signed, and then so on and down to the governor's office. And that may take 2 or 3 days to get there. But once he gets it, it's logged a certain time, and then at the end of the 5th day it becomes law.
Then if he does veto and it comes back to the legislature, it's my understanding it comes to the House where it originated, and then it goes through another process. Would you take us through that?
Yes, Tony. It would come to the originating House, and the question would be, say it was House Bill 200, the question before the House will be, should House Bill 200 pass, the veto of the governor notwithstanding? And if 2/3 majority vote yes, then it has passed that House. It then goes over to the Senate, and the Senate will have the same question before it. And if they pass it with a 2/3 majority, then that becomes the law of the state without the governor's signature.
Again, from following the legislature on a daily basis, as some individuals do, like myself, we also see sometimes that when you're looking at the voting process, like in the House where you are, that because of motions to amend or to table or refer back to committee, whatever is going on, that it is true, isn't it, sometimes that a bill that a sponsor or co-sponsors have dealt with has been so changed that it can even reach the point to where a member might even rise in opposition to their own bill because of the changes. Have you observed that since you've been in the legislature?
Yes, almost that same scenario, and it's it's too bad Senator Kubert wasn't with us today, unable to be with us today, because he was the mischievous guy with the amendment that did that on a bill here a couple years ago. There was a bill to make somewhat more difficult the initiative process in the state, and it wasn't really the bill's sponsor, but it was a major employer in the state and a major business interest in the state was firmly behind it, as was a number of the interest groups in the state. And amendment that seemed very innocuous was placed on it in the House, planted by Senator Kubert, by the way, and we didn't know what we were voting on, and when it got on the bill, it essentially destroyed it, and the proponents of the bill withdrew their support if that amendment stayed on. We subsequently went back to the amending order, general orders, and took that amendment back off and restored the bill to its original form. That may sound to viewers that, you know, it's terrible to have the guy say we don't know what we're voting on, but one of the areas that I'm concerned about down there is the way we handle what is called general orders. It's the amending order where technically the House resolves itself into committee of the whole House. It's officially not the House of Representatives operating, but it's this committee to consider amendments to bills, and it has different rules in the House. And the rules provide for 5 minutes of debate in favor and 5 minutes against. It prohibits any questions, and the amendments may arrive in a thick packet on your desk only moments before the committee dissolves, or even as the committee is operating, amendments come around. And unfortunately, you have to rely a good deal on the sponsors and the opponents' debate on those amendments. You really have not insufficient time to study the amendments. So it's one of those weaknesses in the process where things can happen, and people live in fear of their pet piece of legislation arriving on general orders because they know that anything can happen. And of course, one of the favorite tricks is to offer an amendment which strikes the enacting clause, which has the effect of there's no law. You've still got the bill with all its provisions, but the clause that says be it enacted is gone, and so therefore the law doesn't exist. That can happen to you. All kinds of amendments that are designed to make your bill undesirable may be offered in an attempt to kill the bill. So it can happen. Strange things can happen on general orders, and in that case it did, and proponents of the bill withdrew their support.
Also, I think you're indicating something else to our viewers, and that is that when elected to the state legislature, among other things of learning the organization and the process, it is very helpful to become informed on parliamentary procedure, because there are so many different parliamentary moves that can be made. And as you're indicating, especially near the end of the session when it gets so busy, you're voting on a lot of legislation per day, aren't you? And all kinds of motion being made. And how would one rise to address the chair, however, if one is so confused at that point they aren't sure what's happening? You do have that right before voting, is that not correct?
Well, you have the opportunity to rise and ask a question of anyone in the body. Usually be asking of a sponsor, for example, if you're unclear about some provision. They can or cannot yield your question, and invariably they would yield your question. One of the problems under the general orders set of rules is there are no questions, and that's where some of the problems can come up. And in fact, some of us are proposing that the rules be changed and that amendments be before us for a longer period of time prior to acting on them, and that we have the opportunity to question, because it seems ludicrous to us to be dealing with important measures and not have that opportunity. You mentioned parliamentary procedure. A good knowledge of parliamentary procedure gives you an added measure of power in the body. There's no question about that, because you can stall, you can derail things, you can expedite things if you are very knowledgeable on the rules of parliamentary procedure. Another thing that probably on your list to ask me, but I thought it was where you were heading with your last question. You learn, once you're there a short period of time, to evaluate your peers and form some opinion of of their knowledge in various areas and their credibility. And you rely a good deal on that, especially in those late days when things are happening very fast. You make a certain amount of your judgment, at least I do, based on who's sponsoring the legislation, where they're coming from philosophically, and how credible I think they are. And that may be not on the floor debate, it may also be on questions. Rather than spending 3 hours making yourself intimately familiar with the bill, you may go to someone who serves on the germane committee that you have a good deal of confidence in and say, what's this all about? Is it a good deal or isn't it? And have them explain to you. Because we don't have time to be completely knowledgeable on every piece of legislation that comes through, and I think we have to rely a little bit on our peers in the legislature and this may come as somewhat a surprise to viewers, but trusted lobbyists. I think that the popular public opinion maybe of lobbyists are that sort of unsavory, some of the activities and so on, but it's really not so. They provide a good deal of information about legislation, and they have to be honest with you because their credibility as a lobbyist depends entirely on their being honest, and they're certainly going to shade things to their point of view, but they're going to be straight with you, or they're not a very good lobbyist and they don't last at it very long. So you also pick up information from lobbyists as well as your fellow legislators.
I think it's really important to let our viewers know that are out of state in particular that we do not have very long sessions. In fact, this session was less than 70 days, and to deal with revenue and appropriations and much other kinds of legislation that no one person even has the time to look at every single bill and every detail and every amendment. So I think you've made that point really well. I would like to somewhat close, we're almost out of time, Representative Hageson, by pointing out too that, and I think you've done such a good job doing that, and that might be something that the viewers will take very close note of, and that is that when you're looking at the voting record of anyone in the legislature, that a word of caution is in order, because there'll be several, oftentimes, votes on the same thing, and just to look at that vote and say that person's voted yes twice or no, one needs some kind of understanding of why you voted that way on the amendment. Would you not agree that there's some caution is in order before you come to the conclusion how they were dealing with that piece of legislation?
I think that's absolutely true, yes. You need to, what was the motivation? Someone may have voted against a certain appropriation bill, for example, because they thought it was too high. They might have also voted against it because they thought it was too low. And depending on how you viewed that particular appropriation bill, you may reach the wrong conclusion by saying that the person, voted the wrong way, and without knowing what their motivation was, without knowing what other things might be pending. What was the strategy behind that? So yes, just looking simply at the voting records without finding out what was behind it is dangerous.
Representative Hageson, on behalf of our staff, I want to thank you. Our viewers should know we tape this during the middle of the day, and as a businessman, you took time from your schedule to be here, and we appreciate that. And I know you, like other legislators, are asked to go to a lot of meetings, and you were kind to take time. And I want to inform you that when this is aired, we will catalog in the library for political science students because it's such a good example of how legislation gets through as a guide to them. Thank you again for being here.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for asking me.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Representative Dean Hageson of Coeur d'Alene, discussing with us the process or mechanism of the Idaho legislature. I hope you've enjoyed our program and that you will join us again next week at this very same time. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.